So, welcome Raghu, welcome Parth. Namaste and
Hi.
pranams. Thank you so much for showing up for this conversation. I am a mix of feelings for this conversation. There is excitement, there is a little bit of anxiety, there's so much hope because both of you are people I deeply respect and have shaped my ideas also. Um, and just the context of this conversation, we've been doing one-on-one conversations around the idea of the center, the idea of Indic centrism. And at some stage, the intent was always to move it into the dialogue between thinkers or people who are thinking in this space broadly. And these are all a part of Centrefield. That's the series that I'm working on creating. So this is the first such dialogue. And both Parth suggested that a next step would be dialogues. And then I checked with Raghu saying, Raghu, who would you like to dialogue with? Because the first ever talk was also with Raghu. So Raghu said, let's do it with Parth. So yeah, so here we are. Here we are in that conversation. And your introductions will definitely be in the bio so that people who are seeing this, or mostly they would have heard your individual conversations. So really the expectation for someone listening to this is that the individual podcasts they have heard and we're now hopping into this conversation. So that's where I am. I'm curious though about where each of you is about this conversation with the other. Like, what are you starting with? What do you bring into the conversation? What's your intent for the dialogue, if any? Yeah. So.
You want to go first, Parth?
Parth, you're on mute.
Please go ahead. I'm still thinking, Raghu.
Okay. I'm a little fresh from having listened to your podcast with Abhishek this morning.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are 2-3 things that immediately struck me. Right. One is the Dharampal connection. Okay, because where I am today is entirely because of Dharampal at one level. Yeah, because my wife and I, just when we were finishing college, Dharampal ji had landed up in Chennai. And so a group of us were involved with him and Dr. Seshadri and so on. And we were part of the PPST. And my wife was one of the trustees of PPST. So we've had a lot of long and very interesting, intense dialogues with Dharampal ji. And both of us went into studying with a great Indian teacher because Dharampal's insistence. He said, if you really want to understand India, go and study with a master. Yeah, study for at least 10 years. And you're not studying to glorify India. You're studying to see whether there is something in Indian thought that can deal with contemporary problems. Yeah, so both of us spent about 10 years or more. I studied with Krishnamacharya. I studied yoga from the point of view of the mind and transformations. And my wife Sashi studied the Vastu Shastra. Right? As an architect. She was an architect and she's, looking at it in a fresh way, kind of a thing. So that was one thing that immediately struck me. Right? And I really think it's time that people listen to Dharampal ji with a lot more respect than they've done so far. Yeah.
I also, Raghu, came to Dharampal's writings largely through his work in education.
Yeah.
Because the book, as you know, that he wrote, The Beautiful
That's
Tree.
right. The Beautiful Tree.
Right?
Yes.
And so at CCS, we have been doing a lot of work in education policy.
That's right.
And this is Gandhi's comment that the British are bringing in very expensive education.
Correct.
And the poor India cannot afford such expensive education. And I was always wondering about, what was the context of that comment. And through that, I found Dharampal's writing and what he had documented,
That's
what
right.
was going on in India and how Indian education was affordable in a way.
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
and
yeah.
scalable.
And
Let's scalable.
yeah, and what a fantastic model it was, na?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
it was not commoditized at all. Education was not
Hmm.
not commercialized and commoditized,
Yeah. So
which
that's
is
how
what has
I first
happened
came to
today.
Dharampal ji. I did not know about much of his other writings, frankly, until this year. So I just happened to get to know about the centenary celebrations, which are going on this year and the next year.
That's right.
And Geeta ji, the daughter of Dharampal.
That's right.
So I just found
And
her on
some
by
correct.
accident,
Oh,
and
okay.
she sort of shared with me about what is going on. And then I saw the 5-volume work that we collectively published.
That's
So
right.
then just about a few months ago, I ordered the 5 volumes, and I've been sort of slowly going through it.
Yeah.
So far, the
Fascinating.
one that I enjoyed the most is about the Panchayati Raj. And that certainly
Absolutely.
has caught my attention quite a lot, because that's also close to what I do in terms of political economy, like politics and economics. So I think that debate around Panchayati Raj, what was the take of various founders at the time of the debate on the constitution.
Absolutely.
Right? So that really, I'm really finding that very fascinating. And reading up
Yeah,
more
there's
and more
one very
on that issue.
there's one very interesting part of the history part that because he talked about Panchayati Raj and criticized some of Nehru's thoughts, yeah, he had to leave the country. That's when his entire he went to England, stayed there, and lot of his study happened because of that. Because he and Meera Ben were asked to do the work on Panchayati Raj.
Oh, I didn't know that part of the story.
Yeah,
When you
that's
think
a
of
sad part of the story.
having to run away from a country is a modern phenomenon. I didn't know that
No,
happened at that time.
he had to run away because he was threatened with jail. And some of his friends said, it's better that you not get into this tangle and so on. Yeah.
So that's an important part of the history that somebody should talk about. Yeah.
Yes. And some of the stories that some of them he's written about, and even till the end of his life, he had an extremely great respect for the common Indian man. Right? And whenever we guys would discuss things with him, once in a while he'll pop up this question, have you talked to the farmer? Have you talked to so and so? Are you giving some theory of your own? Do you know how? Yeah. He asked us to talk to the common man who was always keeping quiet in R.K. Lakshman's cartoons. So
great. I think that's a great common ground between us. I'm sure that many of the people in this conversation also probably aware of his work, even if they may not have been as involved as you have been.
Definitely.
So,
yeah.
Mm.
So Raghu,
No,
you
he's
said
very important.
things.
He's very
you
important.
said, yeah, definitely very iconic and important for this work. And going to Raghu, you said 2-3 things. So one was Dharampal ji. What other things stood out for you in the conversation that you want to?
The other thing was, I'm very interested in some of the things you were talking around. For example, right now I'm working with the concept of Dharma. What is Dharma in today's context? I think individual transformation is very, very key. And obviously, education, individual transformation, systemic transformation are all connected. Yeah, and one of the things that I've been concerned about is corruption. And by corruption, I don't mean financial corruption. The corruption of thought, the corruption, the way colonization as an idea has taken over, the way individualism and bad science has taken over, right? And how much economic thought is built around pushing people into an atomized, individualistic context. Yeah, and some of the monolithic ideas of structures, all of these are matters of great concern to me. And it struck me that most of the work I've been doing in this area has been experiential, on the ground kind of thing. Yeah, the work that I've done with the Kudam, for example, along with Suresh and Pradeep Prabhu, is really understanding the democratic principles at the grassroots, and having worked with it, how much those democratic ideas are still in the minds of the common people, but how it's very fast getting corrupted. Yeah, because I've seen good panchayats work very early in my work on the ground, and I've seen it corrupted by political interference in the panchayati raj system. Yeah, how elections, panchayat elections have corrupted the whole thing completely. Yeah, so I mean, I was just thinking of these things when I was listening to you.
Yeah.
So I don't have any high-flown theories, Parth. I work on the ground.
No, two things I noticed after hearing your sort of talks. One, that first thing I realized that you are thinking much more broadly and far deeply than I am. So my sort of thing is much more, and I think more sort of nuts and bolts of it in a way. But I think you have gone far deeper into.
No, I was thinking the opposite, Parth.
understanding
I was thinking I've just gone into the nuts. I'm a mechanic and a crafts person. Crafts person, I guess, Abhishek, more than a mechanic, no?
Yes, bilkul. An artist, I would say. But yeah.
That was my first impression, hearing your thoughts on it. And second thing, one term that you used, which I found very interesting, was a scientism. Right? I think something that you also referred to now in terms of the abuse of science.
Yeah.
And I heard that term for the first time through Friedrich Hayek. I don't know if you would have heard of his name. He's one of the economists who won a Nobel Prize in 1970s, along with Gunnar Myrdal.
Okay.
Myrdal was on the left side of the spectrum. Hayek was on the other side of the spectrum in a way, and they got jointly awarded Nobel Prize. Right? And he has a pretty large body of work focusing on this term scientism, and talks about how the abuse of science. Obviously, initially in the context of the social sciences, because he's a philosopher, economist, and talks about how the social sciences have gone astray, particularly economics, right, by trying to imitate physical sciences.
Absolutely.
And the imitation of physical sciences by social sciences is what he terms as scientism. So having this one model of science, right, which is a model of physics, so to say, right, which is one way of doing science. And his argument has been that people have been sort of seduced by that one model and somehow think that the same model applies everywhere else in life.
Yeah. Right. In psychology also they talk about physics envy.
Yes, physics envy.
Of trying to measure what cannot be measured. Yeah, but also I think scienticism has taken an even worse turn, where people who don't even have much of an idea of science keep on quoting science completely out of context. They don't know the method of science, they don't know the rigor of science, and keep using it left, right, and center to justify their opinions and appear correct. Because today, if you want to shut somebody up, you quote some science. Yeah, and if the person on the other side knows good science, that's great. But if that person doesn't, he'll just get had.
Absolutely true. I don't know if you have a response to that, Parth. But meanwhile, I think one of the things I wanted to throw in also vis-a-vis both of you, and the joy of being in conversation with both of you is, I think for me, one of the things that's so appealing is that both of you have such evangelism potential, and you choose not to be evangelists but open-minded seekers. Like, you have so much in terms of ideas, and like I really feel myself cheering so many times when some of these ideas happen. And I really value the open-mindedness and the willingness to dialogue. I think for me that is such a beautiful shared trait that I see, and that brings us to this conversation. So I think, and while there are so many things that are exciting about this conversation, I think for me, one of the most exciting is what is an Indian vision for India. Look, going into the future, what is an Indian vision for India, and what is an Indian democracy for India? Like, what are Indian ways? And my intent for this inquiry is because one is, it's a very deep personal inquiry as a child of India. Really, what are my ways, and what is a way to reclaim those ways? And also, this knowledge is very actionable for us as younger, kind of the action generation on the ground. I think
Yeah.
this is gold for us. This is this gives us the perspectives which are excluded from so many other spaces. So, what I check, Parth, if you're around, and if you have any response on the scientism. I think Raghu, you expanded it a little bit. So, just wondering if Parth is around or he.
Yes, I'm very much around. I'm just sort of changing my position, so I'll switch off my camera during that time. I think so. There are 2-3 ways of sort of moving forward on this particular theme of scientism. One, obviously, I think what Raghu has defined in his previous talks and what he defined now, right? And then how do we sort of apply that understanding to current challenges? I mean, a very good example would be our COVID and the pandemic that we have been going through, and how science has been used or abused in a way. And as you know, there are so many examples, starting with CDC kind of instructions and guidance they had given out in the beginning of the pandemic, and how that has changed over a period of time, right? And not just CDC. I think CDC is just one prominent example because everybody knows about them, the US agency. So people keep track what they are saying. The same is holds true for what our agencies have been doing in India. Right? So I think that's a very good application of scientism, and see what has happened in our experience with the pandemic. Right?
Yeah, I think
so that's a go ahead.
No, I think that's a great example, Parth, because it also talks about how conditioned and how colonized our people are in their thinking. Because the two of my very good friends who are Ayurvedic people, and their way of dealing with COVID and the successes they've got is very interesting. But they have to fight with what I'm calling scientism. Na? People who don't come, people who don't study what they have done, and both of them have got PhDs in their area of work, so they know science. But the moment you say Ayurveda, you get treated as though you don't know and things like that. Na? And the thought and the rigor behind Ayurveda is immense. It's much more rigorous than many of the doctors I know. Yeah, so it really captures the whole issue, Parth.
Yeah.
In at home, Ananya, my daughter, has restricted Suruchi from the phrase according to Ayurveda, because Suruchi has so many things that she brings based on her understanding according to Ayurveda. And Ananya is like, no, I don't want to know according to Ayurveda, because she has to do things. So it's interesting that you bring it. But also, I think for me, one dimension of this is ways of knowing, right? Like, to me, science is a way of knowing, not the way of knowing reality or oneself. And I think when we exclude subjective experiences from way of knowings or traditional wisdom, I think that monopoly over the way of knowing itself is problematic. And I think now even crumbling, right? Because it's reached its limits. So, yeah, so I think that's one thing that got evoked as well as we were sharing.
Now, Abhishek, the work that I've done in the Kudam, I was saying, is actually a great respect for subjectivity. And whatever work we've done work in Orissa, we've done work in the Northeast, we've done work in Tamil Nadu, we've done work in tribal areas. The wisdom that people bring in and their ability to understand consensus building, and then to understand what it takes to be disciplined about a consensus once it's been reached. It's phenomenal, yeah? And we've seen it work over and over again. So the groups that we've worked with know what is the process of dialogue. During the process of dialogue, there's a huge respect for each person, what they bring in, their background, and things like this. Right? The word dharma is very easily understood by these people. Once they come up on a decision, they're very disciplined about saying, okay, so and so knows more than me. He or she will take the lead. I'm going to help in this way. I'm going to follow in this way. So to me, that was another thing I was very, triggered with when I was listening to the discussion you and Parth were having. Because if you use, democracy, not democracy, this, that, and the other in the current ways of looking at it, how do you classify this? You can't classify this. Because they know when democracy is going to work, when democracy is not going to work. So they switch. So till a shared meaning is arrived at, till a shared decision is arrived at, there's a lot of dialogue, very intense dialogue. Yeah? And respectful dialogue. Right? Once it's reached, they're very clear. Yeah? Who is the person who can really help us to execute? And they go with it.
Yeah. A richer texture to the black and white binary, it is democratic or not. I think it's so much richer than that, right? I think very contextual also.
Exactly. And this is what I've seen working in Panchayati Rajas of the old. In Panchayats of the old, I've seen this working. I've not seen it recently.
This, when
that's
you say
an
this,
interesting point of discussion about
clarification, Raghu. Sorry, when you say this, you mean this contextual form of democracy where there is dialogue as well as the discipline to follow through decisions once taken, right? Is that okay?
Correct.
Yeah, sorry, Parth, you were saying.
Which is really having the punch. Yeah, the 5 wise people sitting there, people gather under the tree. Every part of the village has to be represented. It's like a modern fishbowl, na? So there'll be about a half a dozen guys arguing it out, a whole set of people from the village watching it. If they don't like what this guy says, they'll shout at him and say, no, you're not representing me properly. It seems very chaotic, but it's extremely sophisticated. At the end of which they'll say, okay, for the village, this is the right thing to do. And then they go, the elders say, okay, let's so and so do it or whatever. They have their own ways of deciding who will execute it. And the whole group along with the panchayat is accountable for the execution. That's just not there today.
I think that's an important, part of the history that we seem to have forgotten. And as I read the book on Panchayati Raj and the debate around in the Constitutional Assembly, right? And I was a bit surprised to find the idea was dismissed by saying that details have not been worked out yet. And now to work out the details in 1948-49
would delay the constitution by too much, it will make it too late. And therefore, for the sake of getting the constitution done in reasonable period of time, which I presume they must have decided by 1950s, they wanted to get it done, that we need to now park this idea of Panchayati Raj on the side. We would just include as a directive principle of state policy as one simple idea that this is something people should be thinking about in the future as we move forward in implementing or working on the constitution, right? And I was so surprised that given the fact that it was such a big idea and such a unique idea,
Absolutely.
also unique in the sense of our own history, right?
Absolutely.
It wasn't just somebody who, Gandhiji or anybody else, just thought of it and put it on the paper as this is a great idea for us to consider as we move towards independent India, right? That idea had such a huge history in India, right? And so many people committed to it, right? Just before 1947, just before Gandhi's sort of assassination in a way, right? And I'm just thinking that maybe just because that he wasn't there, a lot of people who were committed to Panchayati Raj probably lost their heart, right? And then gave in, चलो अब सब लोग बोल रहे हैं कि काफी टाइम लग जाएगा to work out the details of how do we run the Panchayati Raj system from bottom up. Ambedkar even talks about the world's constitutions, all constitutions that they have studied and seen are always about top down. They talk about what the central government or the union or the federal government would do and what the state governments would do, and then leave things to the local government as a residual, right? So all constitutions are designed that way. And therefore, for us to think completely opposite manner, right? To think from bottom up as opposed to top down is just going to take so much time. And we don't have that time. And therefore,
that was
we
very
this idea
strange,
of Panchayati Raj on the side and move forward.
No, but it's very strange, Parth, because if you allow this dialogue to happen, you don't need a constitution the way it's been written now. You need a constitution only if we want to bring uniformity, obedience, and a hegemonical idea of control and power. Here, what happens is there's a very clear understanding that I have power to decide. So everybody is invited until they decide. It's very clear that anybody can say no. I've seen this happen. If one section of the people think that the other section of the people are not doing things which is going to be beneficial for them, they walk out. There are various ways in which they handle this. And then there is an executive portion which has got all this top down. They respect that hierarchy. The example of the way this is gone is very clearly saying we have to get westernized.
And I think I don't want to blame people, but I think understandably, you can understand the training the people had at the time, the way the world was working, right? And the ideas were sort of circulating. You can sympathize with the approach that some of the founding sort of fathers took in a sense, right? But I was really surprised to see the debate captured by Dharampal ji. It's a very small book that he has, and it's just reprinted parts of the Constitutional Assembly debates. That's all he has done by and large, right? And I think one fundamental question of the drafting committee that was being formed, the 7 members of the drafting committee, K. Munshi was one of them and other members. And what Dharampal ji points out is that quite a few of them actually never met. The drafting committee of the Constitution actually never met as a full committee.
Wow.
Yeah.
For several reasons. Obviously, one, of course, traveling was difficult, obviously, in those days, right? People were older. So a couple of members were too old to sort of travel too often to be able to part of the meeting in Delhi, right? A couple of people had other commitments and they didn't see much value in coming to the meeting for whatever reason. We don't know yet, kyun aisa hua, right? And so what he points out in the book is that the drafting committee of our constitution the 7 members chaired by Dr. Ambedkar never seem to have met. There's all 7 people sitting down together and discussing it.
Wow.
Right? So, I mean, I'm just studying this right now, so I don't want to jump to conclusions. So please, please take this with a very large pinch of salt in a way. But yes, just what I have been able to do in last month or month and a half, just going through these documents and some of the other constitutions. There's of course Gandhian constitution, which was prepared earlier by Principal Agarwal, and that was offered to them, which actually details quite a bit about how Panchayati Raj can work, right? So the comment on the other side that it would take too much time to work out the details, and therefore let's move forward with what we currently have, right? So there are lots of problems there. First, what you currently have is not really drafted by the committee. If you believe what is being said, they never met as a committee, right? So it's largely point of view of a couple of people who were active, who were sitting in Delhi, had the access to resources, right?
Exactly.
All of that, and they put it together.
And many key provisions were overruled quite summarily by Nehru and company and changed in the last minute. Ambedkar almost walked out. But the context of all this, Parth, is also, and Dharampal has talked about it, there is a series of letters exchanged between Gandhiji and Nehru before independence, where Gandhiji is talking about many of these things, saying we are going to get independence very soon and let's recreate India from the village, right? And then you have Nehru summarily rejecting it and saying we have to be scientific, we have to be westernized and so on, very clearly, right? And interestingly, there's a third point of view of Ambedkar, which is also very interesting. He says that Gandhi is romanticizing the village. They are cesspools of certain kinds of hegemonies and things like that. So I often feel that there were 4 or 5 very, very interesting points of view at the turn of the independence, right? While these people were engaging in a dialogue of some kind, post-independence, this dialogue has broken down, and these have then become political power stances rather than a space of dialogue. And we are facing the consequences of all of that. We are facing the consequences of a broken dialogue.
So, quick question, sorry, this is a pop-up question, that this dialogue you're saying, Raghu, and you've named Gandhiji, Ambedkar, Nehruji. Think who else would you put as historical figures? We've spoken about Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo.
Subhash Chandra Bose, right? These are people immediately who come to my mind. At least these 2 have to be there.
Would you put Tagore also? Rabindranath Tagore in? Or
Rabindranath Tagore.
Parth, any else from your end? You would put
Vivekananda. Vivekananda.
They're also as part of the Congress in the early 20s, late after 1920s. There was a Socialist Party, right, which was part of the Congress, and very large, very influential group of people, right?
Yeah.
And they also had a very similar ideas. So in some sense, Gandhiji's point of view about Gram Swaraj and village republic was not just unique to his followers. Right? It's a much larger group of people, including socialists, who were quite initially, of course, sympathetic to communist model of Soviet Union, but many of them became very disenchanted with it when Stalin came to power. They saw, in a sense, what that is going to deliver. The centralized power in any form is going to ultimately be abused. And they saw exactly what was happening in Soviet Union when they centralized the power in one single party and therefore a single committee, right? And therefore, many of them, including Jayaprakash Narayan, particularly
JP, I was just going to say JP and his entire
JP, right, who became champions of these ideas and kept fighting lonely battles after independence, right? And I just came across, I have read JP quite some time ago. I never, so I think even M.N. Roy, humanist, rationalist, humanist sort of, school of thought, right?
That's right.
Obviously, many JP, Minu Masani, as we know from the other side of the spectrum in the Swatantra Party, right? They're all socialist, communists at some point in time. Right?
That's right.
Slowly they moved away from it and became more and more Gandhian.
Exactly.
They saw what Gandhi was offering was really the fine balance. Right? Even though Gandhi may not have articulated so many things, I mean, of course, he wrote quite a lot, but some of the ideas I don't really find well articulated in his own writings. Maybe he spoke about them and people understood through verbal conversations, right? And many of them were very sympathetic to sort of idea of Gram Swaraj, right?
Absolutely.
And I mean, I'm surprised how many people were in support of it. And that's a surprising thing, that despite the fact that so many people across political spectrum, right, not just Gandhians in a way,
Kumarappa.
And
Kumarappa has written a lot about it, Parth.
Who?
Kumarappa.
J.C. Kumarappa.
Yes.
J.C. Kumarappa has wrote quite a bit about it.
I think he wrote more on economic side of it, right? Or does he?
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So even Rajaji would put no Parth on the table.
That I agree with the political part of Gandhi, right? But not the economic part of Gandhi. So I heard this constant battle in my own mind and heart, right? Somehow, and maybe that's also because of my own training, right? I'm an economist by training. I studied PhD, I have PhD in economics. So obviously, right, this is all 10, 15 years of doing that kind of work, obviously. And at an age where you are very impressionistic in a way, right? And you have spent time doing this work, published papers and all of that. So you're sort of committed to some of these ideas far more deeply than you realize. Right? And so that is really true, that I yet have not been able to reconcile with the Gandhian ideas of economics. Except for one idea, which I think I'm still very open to it, which is the idea of trusteeship. And Gandhi's way of thinking about how do we manage wealth, right? Wealth is going to be created, and any society which is worth some degree of freedom is going to have inequality of wealth distribution. Right? And Gandhi, I think, accepted that fact. There will be inequality of distribution, but he thought that maybe people can rise above it to their own dharma and practice a different way of exercising using their wealth, right? And that could be one way to sort of deal with the side effects of wealth inequality, which is natural part of society, according to him. Right? So I think I like that idea. I'm still very clear how you implement the idea, other than obviously.
No, Parth, this idea, see, there's a lot of Dharampal's work that talks about how this idea was implemented. And I do a lot of intensive work with people, in the sense of sitting with them for weeks, 10, 15 days, and really listening to where they are from and things like that. Now, I met one person who was the grandson, of people who had been in power around the time when the British came and the laws changed and things like that. I won't go into more detail about this person, because that will get to naming. But the way the nation was governed at that time, before British taxation came, right, was that there were families which were governing large cooperative processes, right? For example, you have chatrams. You know what's a chatram? No, I don't know what it's called in the north. These are pilgrimage places. In every pilgrimage place, there will be a fairly large, establishment, right? This is for pilgrims to come and stay. Now, a pilgrim cannot stay.
Dharamshala?
Pardon?
Like a Dharamshala?
Dharamshalas.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, they're called chatrams in the south. Yeah. So these are governed. There's a very beautiful way of governing this. Yeah. One, the local produce gives a certain amount to them as part of the taxation process. That itself is very interesting. So if you read Claude Alvarez, he talks about this in detail. Yeah. And the governance is through a family which looks after many of these things in the pilgrimage areas. Every pilgrim who comes there can stay for about 3 days or 4 days. There's some rule about it. He can't stay more than a week. Free food, free stay. Right? Any destitute woman in that area is protected by this place. Children born orphans are protected in this space. Yeah. Now what happened was, to govern this family, for example, would be given about 1/6, 1/8 of the produce that happens in that whole area. Right? What these families did, many of these families were educated families. So when the British came here and they wanted to implement laws, they said, look, all these people are giving their taxation to us. So they got pattas written up in their name and took over all those lands as their lands. And they stopped supporting the Dharamshalas. They stopped supporting the Chatrams. So they immediately became rich. And they were lackeys of the British. Many of them were given pagadis and given, titles and things like that, and they sold the country for that. These forms of trusteeship is what Gandhiji is talking about. Yeah, and they're not difficult to implement at all. If you go with an honest mind, this is not difficult to implement. Yeah, somebody is trusted to use that money for the right things. Now, if these people had said all of this is my land and continued to do what they were committed to do, right, then they were being trustees.
Yeah, I think history is not very well known. Whatever reason, one can blame various things for it.
Obviously, you wouldn't know, Parth, because the guys who were educated were doing this. Why would they write about it?
I think
surprised even after 75 years of independence, so ignorant, right? In terms of battling out ideas, what things went wrong in the past, right? This is different way. Just in terms of understanding what we did, how did it govern itself, how did places in India govern themselves, right? Just as a narrative of factual description of what happened, right? We can debate whether that was the right thing or not a right thing, whether we should have continued the same way in the future or not, and should have taken a different path, right? So all of those debates are certainly valid and worth doing. But I think just understanding who we were, how we lived, how we governed, right? This actual part is not really well documented, well known, unfortunately.
There's a reason for that, no, Parth? Why these things were not documented. We know why Dharampal was not accepted as a valid historian, though his work was excellent. No? These are all the political movements in the country that we are suffering.
I think that's certainly one thing we could focus on, Abhishek, right?
Yes.
The dialogue that you are organizing and people that you are bringing together. I think just creating that common shared understanding.
Shared understanding of our history.
Who we were.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I thought it would be good. I mean, this is a great opening conversation. So I wanted to just maybe just also being mindful of the time, name certain conversations that need to happen. I don't know where both of you are on time. Is 1 o'clock reasonable, or is the time beyond that? One. Okay, great. So then the last 10 minutes, I think what I'd like to do, a very initial conversation. So I think one conversation that came up for me, like one is what Parth has named, right? Who are we really and where are we coming from, the shared history, and what is it to reclaim that history? One that came to me was what is dharmic technology? Because I think for me, what was interesting when Parth, you were saying that your disagreement with Gandhian economics, for me, that manifests more as the conversation on technology, from techno-optimism to what is a real relationship with technology going ahead. So I think for me, that is definitely one inquiry I want to park and mark, saying what role should technology, because for me, economics also flows a little bit or is related a bit. Yeah, Raghu, sorry, you said.
No, just one thought. Na? I'd like to add one more feature. I don't think the issue is just technology. It's also the mind of the inventor. Yeah. Open source technology is far superior technology to much of the internet stuff that we are using. You have many of these technologies, na? Wikipedia, Apache, right? The mind of that inventor is not a greedy mind.
Yeah.
If we may use Gandhian terminology, na? It's a trusty mind. This guy is holding knowledge in trust, right? The open source, the guy who invented open source, for example. It's such a democratic idea. So it's got to do with the mind of the inventor and education. Why do we hold up Microsoft and Apple as the great guys of today and the inventors of Wikipedia and open source who have done much better technology? Why are they not held up equally as icons? That's because you and I look at heroism in a very, very different way. We appreciate greed. We don't appreciate real invention.
I think this is definitely a dialogue to happen, because I know Parth will have a take on this also, and it'll be a great conversation to have, the mind of the inventor and the role of creativity and how we look at our heroes and the role of greed, and I think what are the limits to those. So that's a rich one.
Yeah, I think also brings into the intellectual property rights, the patents and copyrights and all of those issues.
Yes, which you have done a lot of thinking about, I'm sure, Parth, on some of these topics. Yeah. So I definitely think that's a rich area to have a conversation in. I'm only wondering also, would it be nice to do a round robin first with various combinations, or to continue this dialogue deeper? So I'm going to reflect a little bit on that. There are both options that are there. Raghu, you seem to have a...
No, I'm saying I'm fine with whatever you think will work, Abhishek.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thanks for that.
You test it out, see how it goes.
Yeah. I'll do that.
In a sense, you are the sutradhar. So
Thank
it's
you. Yes.
the things you would have to take your own judgment.
Yes, I will.
I think most of us that you are interacting with will be very happy to go along in terms of
Lovely.
what is going to serve the larger purpose. Right?
Great. Sounds great. So I thought we could just check out with how this dialogue, or very initial, very, very exploratory dialogue, was for you, and what does it leave you with? Maybe that would be a nice way to close this. If you reflect back on our previous hour, if anything stands out for you, that would be nice to close.
I think one thing that for me was just finding this common ground, right? And figuring out, I used the sort of the one that I found, the scientism, as a sort of common ground, something that I understood very well, at least from my point of view, that Raghu talked about from his point of view. And I can see how they both sort of mesh together and create a much richer way of thinking about the use and abuse of science. Right? I think the other thing is the Panchayati Raj, an idea of our own history. Right? And I have to admit that I certainly have been quite oblivious to it in a big sense, right? All these years. Only recently I've been sort of digging deeper into it and trying to understand what has happened in our own history. I think that's really is a great, irrespective of what we do with the knowledge, right? How do we use that knowledge today? But is understanding that history, making sure that people in India also know about that, how we lived and govern ourselves, right? I think it's a very important part of who we are. And I agree with the coloniality, which is the term which is now being used by many people. And of course, there are many on the right, in a way, on the BJP side, who have been using that term also more frequently now as a part of the ideological battle that they are fighting, right, from their point of view, against the Congress and the Nehruvian era that they think was a disaster for India. I think so. I think thinking from that larger point of view about sort of colonial influence, not just in terms of what happened economically and politically in terms of a constitution, but also I think socially, right, and emotionally and intellectually. And I think many of us are not really aware of it. Maybe we are aware at one level, the conceptual level, but we are not able to sort of see that through how it plays out in your own everyday life and everyday thinking.
Sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The two words that stand out to me, Abhishek, one is shared angst. Yeah. And the other is shared hope.
Oh, lovely. Beautiful, beautiful. That's lovely. Yeah. For me, I was just overjoyed or very happy about seeing that common ground and people like Dharampal ji emerging. I mean, I can literally feel like the resurgence or the acknowledgement of forgotten heroes or people who've not been celebrated at their stature, and some of that felt very alive for me. And yeah, really happy to see that though both of you to me come from very different journeys, the level of common ground was frankly surprising for me also. Because so it was a pleasant surprise. I think the edginess was about saying what's going to happen, because I see you all coming from different pathways, but I think we're meeting somewhere in the middle. So feeling a lot of
We're
gratitude
nice.
for both of you.
Abhishek, we're both nice people, Abhishek.
Aw.
Even if we differ, we won't make you feel bad about it. Don't worry.
Yes, we'll hold our differences.
Great
Lovely.
to you, Abhishek, that you have put together a nice people group.
Correct.
Thank you so much. Yes, and I'll also take the responsibility of taking this to a lot of people, so that these ideas.
But Abhishek, if you really want to look at this carefully, we also need to understand why thinkers like Dharampal, their voices were kept down. There are many people like him.
Had to leave the country.
Yeah.
They was forced to leave the country. I mean, that's really rather shocking to me, frankly. Something like that can happen in the 70s and 60s in India.
Yeah,
definitely. And how that process might be operational even today, right? Very actively.
And whose voice is being valorized and whose voices are being pushed down. In many fields, in academia, in political field, in the economic field, and so on. Because I have my own suspicion that if India really touches her heart and reorganizes itself on truly dharmic principles and democratic principles, it will overthrow the economy of the world. Because a Panchayati Raj economy cannot be an economy that spends 30% on war. It will not be an economy that wants to build atom bombs before making sure that one's children are fed and educated. I'm sure Parth will have the numbers. But if we stopped war today, we can feed every person in the world. Educate them, feed them, clothe them, house them. No problem, man. So we have to ask, why is war not being stopped? And it's obviously got to do with hegemonical and hierarchical ways of looking at governance,
Sure.
And there is a logic to it, the way which operates, right? So when India has been very gung-ho about allowing private sector in defense production, right? Which has been sort of long dream, in a sense, of Indian politicians and Indian businesses, right? And you wonder why. Why do we need more people producing weapons? Right? Yes, I can't argue that, okay, you need some weapons. I mean, we are living in a world where you have to be realistic that, yes, you need to buy some weapons and protect yourself, right? But maybe we have been buying it anyway. we continue buying it to the extent that we need them, right? Why do we want to create a world where there are, see, I think the logic of market is that once you create that possibility, right, the self-interest of the business is to expand the market, right? Once Tatas and Birlas and Mahindras get in the business of producing weapons, right, along with all the other guys who are already doing it, right? The logic is that more and more wars are going to happen because somebody has to sell this. Somebody has to recoup that investment, right? And I think that we want to have more manufacturers of weapons, it just makes no sense, right?
Just to add to what you're saying, Parth, the latest little news item I read was France is getting scared that they're not well prepared for war. So they're going to spend some few $100 billion over the next few years on war. It's a small news item somewhere.
Whoa.
Exactly what you're saying.
They felt snubbed by what Australia and the US did. But I think it's just amazing that, there's of course a lot of documentation of how much weapons are being produced and bought and sold, right? I mean, it's a huge, it's not that we don't know, we know, right? We don't talk about it as much, unfortunately.
Yeah. Maybe normalized also in some way, like it almost, we're like hypnotized, or it's normalized that it's obvious. Yeah. There's something about that, right? Not questioning it enough. It's not being questioned enough. So great. So that's also one more conversation. So yeah, looking forward to many rich conversations and hopefully an in-person meeting sooner or later where we get time to deep dive in person. So holding that intention also.
You have a place ready, Abhishek, if you want to come.
Yay! Thank you. Thank you, Raghu. A very beautiful one at that. Ritambhara, I'm guessing, no, Raghu? Lovely. Lovely. Great. Thank you, Parth.
Okay,
thank you,
lovely.
Raghu. Thanks a lot
Thanks for getting us together.
Yes,
Abhishek.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Great. Nice meeting you, Parth.
Very nice meeting you, Raghu. And hope to continue our discussion and dialogue.
Yeah, sure.